Imagine a history so vast, so tragic, and yet so little discussed that it has remained in the shadows for over a millennium. While most of us have learned about the transatlantic slave trade, where millions of Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas, there exists another chapter, equally devastating, that rarely makes it into classrooms or history books: the Arab-Muslim slave trade, also known as the trans-Saharan or Eastern slave trade. For more than 1,300 years, millions of African men, women, and children were captured, transported, and sold across deserts, seas, and foreign lands, enduring unimaginable hardships along the way. This is not just a tale of numbers or rotes. It is a story of human lives uprooted, families torn apart, and communities forever altered. From the earliest records in ancient Nubia and Egypt to the vast trade networks connecting West Africa to North Africa, Arabia, and beyond, the scale of suffering was immense. Men were forced into labor under harsh conditions. Women often faced sexual exploitation, and young boys were sometimes castrated to serve in roles that left lifelong scars. Yet, despite its enormity, this trade has been overshadowed in popular discourse, often ignored due to political, religious, and historical biases. But why does this history matter today? Understanding the Arab-Muslim slave trade is not about assigning blame, it is about recognizing the resilience of those who survived, acknowledging the pain endured by generations, and learning from the past to ensure justice and dignity for all. It helps us grasp the full impact of slavery on African societies and the ways in which these legacies still ripple through time. By exploring these hidden histories, we gain a clearer, more complete picture of the human story, a story of survival, endurance, and the unbreakable spirit of people who refuse to be erased. In this video, we will travel back in time across deserts and ancient cities, follow the routes taken by slave caravans, and uncover how these trades operated over centuries. We will hear about the human cost, the clever strategies used for capture, and the challenges faced by those caught in these systems. Along the way, we will shine a light on stories that history often leaves untold, stories of courage, resistance, and the enduring hope for freedom. If you are ready to explore this hidden chapter of history, do not forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. By doing, you help us continue uncovering these important stories, bringing forgotten histories to light, and honoring those whose lives shaped the world we live in today. Stay with us as we embark on this journey, because understanding the past is the first step toward a more just and informed future. As we begin to grasp the immense scope of the Arab-Muslim slave trade, it is staggering to realize that estimates suggest nearly 9 to 10 million Africans were forcibly taken from their homes, a number that rivals the transatlantic slave trade and underscores the profound human cost that has long been overlooked in history books and public discourse. Picture vast caravans winding their way through the unforgiving deserts of the Sahara, with men, women, and children shackled together, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion, trudging day after day under a relentless sun, often without enough water or food, their lives hanging by a fragile thread as the heat shimmered over endless dunes. These were not isolated incidents, but part of a meticulously organized system that spanned continents and centuries, where the demand for human labor fueled a commerce that touched North Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and even distant parts of the Persian Gulf, shaping societies and economies in ways that are still felt today. The human dimension of these numbers becomes painfully clear when we imagine the individual stories hidden within them. For every figure represents a life uprooted, a family torn apart, and a future violently altered. Young girls, sometimes no older than 10 or 12, were forced to leave the villages they knew, their homes razed by raids or surrendered under duress, only to be transported to distant lands where their value was measured in terms of domestic skills or their perceived potential for service in wealthy households, harems, or as companions in lives far removed from their own. Boys, often captured alongside their families, faced a different but equally harrowing fate, with some subjected to castration to serve as eunuchs, a procedure so cruel that only a fraction survived. Yet those who did were considered highly valuable, entrusted with positions of oversight, administration, and control within households or palaces. In their physical prime, were corralled into grueling labor, sent to cultivate lands, build infrastructure, or carry goods across long distances, their strength exploited for economic gain while their identities were stripped away and their personal freedom obliterated. The routes themselves were perilous, and the desert's cruelty was matched only by the merciless treatment of the traders. Caravans moved in organized lines, guided by experienced Berbers and Bedouins who knew the shifting sands, hidden water sources, and the best paths to navigate treacherous terrain. Yet even their expertise could not guarantee survival. Stories passed down from travelers and chroniclers recount seeing the skeletons of those who succumbed to thirst, hunger, or exhaustion lining the outskirts of oases, stark reminders of the brutal realities that accompanied this trade. It is here that the scale of human suffering becomes almost unimaginable. As for every one person who survived the arduous journey, 3 or 4 did not, leaving behind only silent graves in the unforgiving desert. Despite the enormous losses, the trade continued to expand, driven by a complex interplay of local and foreign demand. Slaves were not only commodities but symbols of wealth and status in various societies, from the urban centers of North Africa to the palaces of the Arabian Peninsula, where acquiring and maintaining a household of enslaved individuals was a demonstration of prestige and influence. The trade also had a profound gendered dimension, as the labor expectations and roles assigned to men and women diverged sharply. While European observers of the time often focused on the economic exploitation of male labor in plantations and mines, the Arab trade emphasized control over women's bodies and reproductive potential, which had far-reaching consequences on population growth, social structures, and family systems within African communities. The demographic impact of this focus on female enslavement was devastating, creating long-term imbalances and contributing to the decline of certain regions while reinforcing the power structures of those who profited from the trade. Religious narratives were sometimes manipulated to provide justification, with interpretations of sacred texts used to rationalize the enslavement of black Africans, including those who were themselves Muslim. Appeals to the so-called curse of Ham became a tool for traders to legitimize the capture and subjugation of entire communities. Despite theological arguments that contradicted such practices, these distortions allowed the trade to persist for centuries, creating a cycle of oppression that was institutionalized in some regions, tolerated by local authorities, and even celebrated in certain records as evidence of status and influence. The enormity of the trade's reach is further highlighted by the variety of destinations and purposes for which enslaved Africans were taken. North Africa, Egypt, and Arabia were central hubs, but ports along the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean facilitated transport even further east, distributing enslaved individuals across the Persian Gulf, Oman, and beyond, where they were integrated into households, workforces, and harem systems, continuing the cycle of labor exploitation and social disruption. Even within Africa, the trade reshaped political dynamics, as local rulers sometimes participated as intermediaries, selling captives to foreign traders, while others resisted, sending urgent appeals to neighboring powers in hopes of halting raids and protecting their populations. Yet amidst this horror, stories of resilience, survival, and courage emerge. Individuals who endured the forced marches, captivity, and exploitation often found ways to resist, to maintain cultural identity, and to survive against overwhelming odds. These human experiences remind us that behind every statistic is a lived life, filled with fears, hopes, and the struggle for dignity. Understanding the Arab-Muslim slave trade in this light is crucial, not only to acknowledge the suffering that occurred, but to recognize its lasting impact on African societies, on cultural memory, and on the global history of human rights. It is a story that challenges us to reflect on the capacity for both cruelty and resilience, and to ensure that the lessons of the past inform our commitment to justice, equality, and humanity today. By exploring this vast and often overlooked history, we gain a more complete understanding of the human experience, and we honor the millions whose lives were irrevocably altered. It is a call to remember, to educate, and to ensure that the echoes of this hidden past shape a future where freedom and dignity are upheld for all. Long before the arrival of Islam in North Africa and the rise of the Arab-Muslim slave trade, the practice of enslaving human beings had already been woven into the fabric of African societies and neighboring civilizations. A stark reminder that the commodification of human lives is a tragedy that spans both time and geography. In the banks of the Nile, ancient Egyptians conducted raids into Nubia, capturing men, women, and children to serve as laborers in monumental construction projects, as domestic servants, or even as soldiers pressed into military campaigns. Their fates often sealed by the whims of conquerors and kings whose visions of power and grandeur relied on the labor of the subjugated. These early patterns of enslavement were not mere isolated acts of cruelty but part of structured, systematic efforts to harness human strength for societal and economic gain. And they left enduring marks on the communities that bore the brunt of these practices. To the south, the Nubians themselves, though frequently victims of Egyptian campaigns, were also participants in regional dynamics of power and capture, reflecting a complex interplay where political alliances, warfare, and the economics of survival intersected. The Garamantes, a civilization rooted in what is now southern Libya, further demonstrate the wide geographic reach of early slave trading, relying heavily on sub-Saharan African captives to construct and maintain intricate underground irrigation systems that sustained their desert communities. Known as Phogras, Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian, recounts vividly the methods by which these communities captured so-called troglodyte Ethiopians, chasing them with chariots and binding them into servitude, illustrating both the ingenuity and the ruthlessness that often accompanied early forms of slavery. These accounts, while filtered through the lenses of ancient chroniclers, convey the human suffering at the center of these transactions and hint at the long-standing networks through which enslaved individuals were moved across regions. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean basin, the Romans established extensive trading networks that relied on human captives as both economic engines and social tools. From the urban centers of Leptis Magna to the bustling markets of Carthage, black Africans from the interior were bought and sold, valued for their labor, exotic appearance, or potential integration into households and public institutions. Roman taxation on the trade of slaves demonstrates how integral this practice had become to economic structures, highlighting the ways in which human suffering was codified into the very frameworks of governance and commerce. The scale of these operations may have been larger than what later generations of medieval societies would encounter. Driven by the high demand for labor across a vast empire stretching from the sands of North Africa to the cold northern reaches of Europe. Yet even within this early period, the human toll was immense, with countless lives disrupted, families fractured, and communities left weakened by the constant flow of captives removed from their lands. These historical precedents, while often overshadowed by later and more widely discussed episodes of enslavement, establish critical context for understanding the Arab-Muslim slave trade that would follow. The techniques, networks, and social rationales developed over centuries of pre-Islamic trade laid the groundwork for a system that could span continents and endure for more than a millennium, demonstrating that the subjugation of African peoples was not a sudden phenomenon but rather the continuation and amplification of practices deeply rooted in history. Indeed, when the Arab and Berber traders introduced large-scale camel caravans and organized long-distance routes across the Sahara, they were building upon existing infrastructures and experiences that had long facilitated the movement and sale of human beings, transforming regional practices into a transcontinental enterprise. The historical record reveals that the interplay of geography, politics, and human ambition shaped these early systems of enslavement. With natural barriers like the Sahara and the Nile simultaneously challenging and directing the flow of captives, ancient civilizations adapted to these conditions, employing local knowledge, military strategy, and social networks to capture, transport, and control enslaved population, with repercussions that echoed through generations. While religion, culture, and societal norms differed across these societies, a common thread persisted. The human cost of progress and prosperity was paid by those who had no agency over their fates. Exploring this period allows us to see how deeply interconnected the African continent and the Mediterranean world were, even in antiquity, and how human exploitation served as a driving force behind economic and political power. It also demonstrates that the stories of enslaved Africans are not confined to a single era or empire. Rather, they are part of a continuum, one that underscores both the resilience of those subjected to unimaginable hardships and the enduring consequences for the communities from which they were taken. Recognizing these patterns helps us understand that the Arab-Muslim slave trade, which would later dominate for over 1,000 years, did not emerge in a vacuum but was the culmination of long-standing practices, refined and expanded through technological innovations, trade networks, and shifting power dynamics. By tracing these early forms of slavery, from the Nile Valley to the deserts of Libya and the markets of the Roman Empire, we gain a fuller appreciation of the scope and complexity of human exploitation in history. It reminds us that understanding the past requires attention not only to the acts themselves, but also to the social, political, and economic contexts that allowed them to persist. In doing, we honor the lives disrupted, the courage of those who survived, and the enduring need to acknowledge and learn from histories that have too often been marginalized or forgotten, ensuring that the legacies of the past inform our pursuit of justice, equity, and humanity in the present. As we delve deeper into the harrowing reality of the Arab-Muslim slave trade, it becomes clear that the capture of Africans was a calculated, relentless, and often brutal enterprise, shaped by a combination of military force, deception, and the complicity of certain local authorities. Across the vast landscapes of sub-Saharan Africa, from dense forest to arid savannas, individuals and entire communities were seized in violent raids, their villages attacked in the dead of night, homes burned, and families torn apart as armed groups sought human cargo to meet the insatiable demand of distant markets. These attacks were not random. They were meticulously planned and executed, relying on the intelligence of those who knew the terrain, the rhythms of local life, and the vulnerabilities of the populations targeted. Warriors and traders would strike with precision, sometimes disguising their intentions under the pretense of trade or diplomacy, luring unsuspecting villagers into traps that would lead to captivity, leaving survivors to bear the trauma of witnessing their loved ones marched away under chains. Beyond the open violence of raids, warfare itself served as a mechanism for enslavement. Regional conflicts, territorial expansions, and disputes between rival kingdoms often resulted in prisoners of war being converted into slaves, their fates sealed by the outcomes of battles over which they had no control. Generals and local rulers recognized the economic value in human captives, treating them as both currency and labor resources. The defeated were stripped of their identities, their names replaced by designations that reduced them to property, their destinies intertwined with the trade networks that spanned deserts, rivers, and distant cities. Even the most skilled warriors and leaders could not shield their people from these cycles of violence and capture, as the political and economic systems of the time incentivized the extraction of human labor above all else. Deception, too, played a cruel role in the enslavement process. Stories from historical accounts describe how children and young adults were enticed away from their homes with promises of food, safety, or opportunities that never existed, only to find themselves bound and transported to markets far beyond their comprehension. Parents' warnings and community vigilance were often insufficient against the cunning tactics of traders who exploited trust, familiarity, and desperation. In some cases, local leaders participated willingly, selling captives in exchange for goods, weapons, or political favor, creating a network of complicity that complicated efforts to resist the trade. These layers of coercion, manipulation, and betrayal illustrate how deeply entrenched the system of slavery was, reaching into the very fabric of society and leaving few safe spaces for those at risk. Once captured, the journey itself became a crucible of suffering. Forced marches across deserts were particularly deadly, as individuals were made to traverse hundreds of miles under the relentless sun, their bodies weakened by exhaustion, hunger, and dehydration. Women and children were often bound together with ropes or chains, their movement restricted, their agency stripped entirely, and their survival dependent on the mercy or indifference of their captors. Caravans moved slowly, deliberately, through harsh landscapes where water was scarce, and every step presented the possibility of death from exposure or fatigue. Along the way, some would fall behind, collapsing into the sands, their bodies left behind as grim markers of the journey's peril. Travelers and chroniclers later recounted skeletons at desert springs, silent witnesses to the countless lives extinguished in transit, and estimated that for every one person who survived to reach the markets of North Africa, Arabia, or the Persian Gulf, 3 or 4 had perished along the way. These marches were more than mere transportation. They were instruments of psychological terror. The captives, often witnessing the suffering and deaths of companions, endured constant fear and uncertainty, never knowing if the next step would bring relief or further torment. Children were particularly vulnerable, their small frames struggling under the weight of chains or the demands of the journey, while elders, unable to maintain pace, faced grim choices between death or abandonment. Stories of these forced marches evoke a profound sense of empathy and horror, highlighting the systematic cruelty inherent in the trade and the immense fortitude required merely to survive. The trade routes themselves were carefully orchestrated, often guided by Berber and Bedouin intermediaries who possessed expert knowledge of the desert's geography, water sources, and seasonal patterns. Oasis towns became crucial way stations, offering brief respite in an otherwise relentless journey. Yet even these stops could not erase the suffering endured or guarantee safety. Caravans carrying hundreds, sometimes thousands, of captives would stretch for miles, creating logistical challenges that were often addressed through further harsh discipline and regulation, ensuring that human cargo remained under control despite the extreme conditions. Markets awaited those who survived, but the relief of arrival brought no freedom. Africans were sold as property, their fates determined by the highest bidder. Families were divided, with men sent to labor in construction or agriculture, women and girls placed in domestic servitude or harems, and young boys sometimes destined for castration to serve as eunuchs, a process as brutal as it was irreversible. the intricate network connecting raiding parties. Local rulers, caravan guides, and market buyers ensured that the system could sustain itself for centuries, with the deaths and suffering along the way treated as an accepted, if tragic, cost of operation. Understanding the methods of capture and transportation in the Arab-Muslim slave trade brings into sharp focus the human experiences behind the staggering numbers. It reveals not only the logistical sophistication and economic motivations of the trade, but also the extraordinary resilience of those who endured it. Individuals who, despite unimaginable hardships, found ways to survive, resist, and preserve fragments of their identity in the face of dehumanization. The forced marches, the betrayals, and the deadly deserts were all part of a system designed to exploit, control, and profit from human beings. Yet within this darkness, the stories of courage and endurance emerge, offering a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the enduring need to remember, acknowledge, and learn from this hidden chapter of history. As the endless caravans of enslaved Africans pressed onward across the vast expanse of the Sahara, their destination points were as varied as the landscapes they traversed, each market a hub of commerce, culture, and the grim business of human trade, where the fates of thousands were decided with the stroke of a pen or the clang of a gavel. In North Africa, the cities of Morocco, Algiers, Tripoli, and Cairo served as central nodes in a network that stretched from the heart of sub-Saharan Africa to the bustling ports of the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. These markets were not merely passive locations. They were carefully orchestrated arenas of economic and social interaction, where traders, buyers, and officials coordinated the distribution of captives across kingdoms and empires, ensuring that the flow of human lives matched the demand of distant societies. The scale of activity was immense, with public squares transformed into temporary arenas of negotiation and display, where enslaved individuals were inspected, appraised, and sold, their value determined not only by age, strength, or skill but also by the perceptions and prejudices of those who held the power to decide their futures. The journey to these markets was a crucible of endurance, requiring expertise and guidance that could mean the difference between life and death. Caravans relied heavily on the knowledge and skills of Berbers and Bedouins, whose intimate understanding of the desert's merciless terrain, hidden water sources, and shifting sands allowed them to navigate paths that would have been lethal to the untrained. These guides and protectors were integral to the success of the trade, serving as the linchpins that connected remote villages to urban centers thousands of miles away. Their roles went beyond mere navigation. They provided security against potential attacks, coordinated rest stops, and maintained the pace and discipline of the caravans, often moving through hostile territory where the desert itself was an enemy as formidable as any human adversary. Their expertise was respected and relied upon, granting them a form of authority within the trade system. Yet they too were bound by the economic and social structures that perpetuated the enslavement of human beings. Across these deserts, the journeys were fraught with unimaginable hardship, yet they also demonstrated the careful planning and strategic organization necessary to sustain such a massive enterprise over centuries. Slaves were herded in long lines, their movements carefully monitored, with children and women alike subjected to strict regulations to prevent escape or rebellion. Along the way, Oasis towns offered brief reprieves, but even these temporary havens could not erase the trauma endured or guarantee the safe passage of all captives. Chroniclers and travelers of the era recorded scenes of unimaginable suffering. Skeletons discovered at dried-up wells, the exhausted and parched bodies of those who had fallen behind, and the relentless sun beating down upon rows of chained humans, each step a struggle against both the physical and psychological torment imposed by their captors. The routes themselves were intricate, often determined by centuries of trial and error, with pathways stretching eastward toward the Red Sea ports, southward into the interior of Africa, or westward to the Mediterranean coast. Caravans from West Africa might converge on Tripoli or Algiers, while others would push toward Cairo, guided by the Nile and the surrounding deserts, where the knowledge of local tribes and the wisdom of seasoned desert travelers was essential. From the Red Sea ports, enslaved Africans were transported further afield, reaching the Arabian Peninsula, Persia, and even the Indian Ocean islands, where they were absorbed into labor systems. Domestic service, or harems, illustrating the transcontinental reach of this grim commerce. Zanzibar, in particular, emerged as a crucial node in the Indian Ocean trade, where the economic imperatives of plantation labor, clove cultivation, and maritime enterprise intersected with the human tragedy of slavery, creating a nexus that sustained the system for generations. At these markets, the human cost of the trade became starkly visible. Captives were sorted, appraised, and sold, often in public settings that emphasized their objectification. Women were valued for domestic skills or potential for servitude in harems, while men were assessed for strength and endurance, destined for labor that could range from agriculture to construction. Often far from their places of birth, families were fractured, bonds severed, and identities stripped away, leaving survivors to navigate new lives imposed upon them by circumstances beyond their control. The psychological impact of such transactions, compounded by the grueling journey through deserts and across rivers, was profound, shaping generations and leaving legacies that resonated across both African societies and the distant lands where captives were sent. The logistical sophistication of the trade, coupled with its reliance on local knowledge and regional collaboration, underscores the systemic nature of this human exploitation. Berbers and Bedouins were not merely guides. They were facilitators, enforcers, and crucial participants in a system that endured for over a millennium, their expertise turning impossible landscapes into conduits of commerce and suffering. The deserts, with their shifting dunes and hidden dangers, became silent witnesses to the endurance and pain of millions. And yet they were also arenas where resilience and adaptation were essential, both for the captors and the captives. By understanding the pivotal role of these markets and the guides who navigated the treacherous terrain, we gain insight into how the Arab-Muslim slave trade was able to maintain such a vast, interconnected network for centuries. The combination of meticulous planning, geographical knowledge, and economic incentive allowed the trade to flourish despite the brutality of its methods, while the captives' endurance and the fleeting moments of human solidarity along the way reveal the complexity and resilience of the human spirit amidst unimaginable adversity. This story, woven through deserts, cities, and ports, offers a window into a world where commerce, geography, and cruelty intersected, shaping the course of history and leaving a legacy that demands recognition, reflection, and remembrance. As the enslaved Africans arrived at bustling markets from Cairo to Zanzibar, the fates that awaited them revealed not only the cruelty of the trade, but also the profound social and demographic consequences it inflicted on entire regions. Among the captives, women were often singled out for purposes that extended beyond labor. Their lives reshaped to serve as concubines or domestic servants in distant households, palaces, and harems across the Arab world. These women, torn from families and communities, were thrust into environments where their identities were subordinated to the whims of their owners, where survival required navigating a labyrinth of power, expectation, and coercion. They were tasked with performing domestic duties from cooking and cleaning to caring for children. Yet they were also constantly under the scrutiny of those who viewed them as property, their movements restricted, their voices silenced, and their bodies subject to control in ways that extended far beyond mere physical labor. The psychological toll of this displacement and forced servitude was immense, as women were forced to reconcile their own suffering with the need to adapt to the rules of a foreign and often hostile social order. In parallel, young boys captured in raids or purchased from local rulers faced a fate that was both physically and socially devastating. Many were castrated to become eunuchs, a practice designed to fulfill specific roles within the households, courts, and harems of wealthy families or ruling elites. Castration was an extraordinarily brutal process with a survival rate alarmingly low, and those who lived through it faced a lifetime of altered physiology and constrained social roles. These eunuchs were often entrusted with responsibilities that required trust and vigilance, including managing harems, overseeing domestic operations, or serving as confidential advisors and administrators. Yet their very existence was a testament to the extent to which human lives were commodified and manipulated for social and political purposes. The presence of eunuchs in these systems highlights a paradox of the trade. While their value was measured economically and politically, their very creation represented a profound disruption of the natural demographic balance in the regions from which they had been taken. The cumulative effect of these practices reverberated across sub-Saharan Africa, where the removal of large numbers of women and young men exerted a destabilizing influence on communities. Entire villages and regions suffered from demographic imbalances, with fewer women to sustain family life and fewer men to maintain agricultural productivity. Local defense and cultural continuity. The social fabric of these communities was strained, as traditional roles were disrupted and population growth was hindered by the systematic extraction of human beings. Generations were impacted, not only by the immediate trauma of enslavement, but by the long-term consequences of population loss. With cultural, economic, and familial structures forever altered by the relentless demands of the slave trade. The Arab-Muslim slave trade's emphasis on exploiting women for reproductive and domestic purposes contrasted with the European transatlantic model, which prioritized male labor for plantation economies. In the Arab context, the focus on women's reproductive potential and domestic service led to profound demographic effects, as the removal of young women from their communities curtailed the potential for population renewal and intensified social disruption. Moreover, the practice of creating eunuchs removed a significant number of young males from the population, compounding the effects of loss and contributing to long-term societal instability. Families were left fragmented, traditional lines of inheritance and kinship disrupted, and communities were forced to adapt to the absence of a substantial portion of their population, often under conditions of scarcity and ongoing threat. Yet the story of these individuals was not solely one of victimhood. Within the confines of harems, domestic households, and administrative roles, women and eunuchs often demonstrated remarkable resilience and agency, navigating oppressive systems to carve out spaces of influence, build networks of support, and, in some cases, shape the very institutions that sought to control them. Women in harems could exert subtle but real influence over household affairs, social connections, and even political decisions. While eunuchs, entrusted with sensitive responsibilities, could wield power indirectly, shaping outcomes behind the scenes. These acts of adaptation and agency highlight the complexity of human experience within the oppressive structures of slavery, revealing not only suffering but also courage, ingenuity, and endurance in the face of extraordinary adversity. The trade's long-term consequences on African societies were profound, extending beyond immediate suffering to reshape gender ratios, family structures, and social hierarchies. Traditional marriages were disrupted, childbearing rates altered, and communities faced enduring economic and demographic challenges as a result of centuries of extraction. Cultural practices evolved in response to these pressures, as societies sought to mitigate the effects of population loss and preserve social cohesion despite ongoing threats. In addition, the social memory of these events shaped collective identities, influencing historical narratives, cultural expressions, and the ways communities remembered and transmitted knowledge about survival, resilience, and injustice. Ultimately, the use of women as concubines and domestic workers, coupled with the creation of eunuchs from young boys, exemplifies the multifaceted cruelty and enduring impact of the Arab-Muslim slave trade. It was not only a system of labor extraction, but also a mechanism of demographic manipulation, social control, and long-term societal disruption. Understanding these dynamics allows us to appreciate the full scope of the trade's consequences, recognizing the human lives behind the statistics, the personal tragedies behind historical records, and the enduring legacies that continue to influence societies today. Through these stories, we are reminded of both the suffering endured and the extraordinary resilience displayed, offering lessons on the human capacity for survival, adaptation, and the moral imperative to remember, acknowledge, and learn from history. Throughout the centuries of the Arab-Muslim slave trade, the moral and religious justifications employed by traders and rulers reveal a disturbing intersection of faith, interpretation, and human exploitation, as enslavers sought to reconcile their actions with the teachings of Islam and broader social and cultural norms, often using selective readings of scripture to rationalize the enslavement of black Africans, including those who were themselves Muslims. These interpretations frequently leaned on the so-called curse of Ham, a narrative drawn from earlier biblical traditions that had been adapted into the social and religious imagination of the time to assert that certain populations were divinely ordained to servitude. By invoking this curse, traders constructed a framework in which the capture and subjugation of black individuals could be cast as an acceptable, even righteous, enterprise, providing spiritual and ideological cover for practices that were, in reality, devastating and exploitative. The use of religious pretexts did not exist in isolation but was intertwined with social hierarchies, economic imperatives, and political ambitions that spanned continents. Traders, rulers, and local intermediaries relied on these interpretations to justify raids, purchases, and forced marches across deserts, reinforcing the idea that enslavement was not only legally and morally defensible within their societies, but also part of a divinely sanctioned order. These rationalizations allowed the trade to persist across generations, as merchants and officials could frame the commodification of human beings as consistent with both law and faith, minimizing moral dissent within their communities and reducing resistance from those who might otherwise question the cruelty of the system. Yet the application of these interpretations was inconsistent and often opportunistic, reflecting the ways in which ideology could be manipulated to serve economic and political goals. While Islam, in its canonical texts, prohibits the enslavement of fellow Muslims, the traders' selective reading of scripture permitted the enslavement of black Muslims by emphasizing race over faith, a distortion that facilitated the continuation of the trade even when it violated broader religious principles. Letters and petitions from African rulers to the sultans of Egypt, for instance, attest to the devastation wrought by raids and enslavement, highlighting the widespread suffering inflicted on black Muslim communities who were captured despite their shared religious identity. These accounts reveal the tension between principle and practice, exposing a system in which economic gain and power often overrode moral and legal considerations. The narrative of the curse of Ham itself became a potent tool for social and racial categorization, as it provided a historical and theological rationale for differentiating between populations based on skin color and presumed divine sanction. In the popular imagination of medieval and early modern Islamic societies, blackness became increasingly associated with servitude, a linkage that was reinforced by centuries of trade. Cultural representation and the systematic extraction of Africans from their homelands. This racialized understanding of slavery was further embedded by social practices that emphasized the exploitation of women for domestic and reproductive purposes, the creation of eunuchs from young boys, and the long-term disruption of African demographics and community structures. The interplay between ideology, race, and economic necessity created a self-reinforcing cycle, where religious justification legitimized commercial practices, and commercial success reinforced ideological interpretations. Travelers and chroniclers of the period provide vivid descriptions of how these interpretations were enacted in practice, illustrating the human consequences of such rationalizations. In markets from Tripoli to Zanzibar, captives were often presented in public, their enslavement framed as natural and inevitable, reflecting a societal consensus shaped by centuries of selective interpretation. Merchants would emphasize the supposed moral and religious correctness of their trade to quell objections from observers, employing rhetoric that portrayed the acquisition of black Africans as both lawful and divinely approved. Meanwhile, the captives themselves experienced the stark reality behind these justifications, facing arduous marches, harsh labor, and the fragmentation of families, their lives reduced to commodities even as their captors cloaked their actions in spiritual legitimacy. The reliance on such religious rationalizations also influenced legal and political structures, as authorities codified interpretations that permitted the enslavement of certain populations while ostensibly protecting others. Courts, local officials, and religious leaders were complicit in maintaining these distinctions, providing official sanction and social reinforcement for practices that undermined the very moral and spiritual codes they were meant to uphold. This legal and ideological scaffolding ensured that the trade could operate on a massive scale, reaching millions of Africans over centuries and spanning regions as far-flung as the Mediterranean, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Indian Ocean. Even as opposition to the slave trade grew within and outside the Arab world, these religious justifications lingered, influencing attitudes toward race, labor, and social hierarchy long after the formal abolition of the trade in various regions. The cultural memory of enslavement, intertwined with selective interpretations of scripture, shaped narratives of African inferiority and societal acceptance of exploitation, creating enduring legacies that continue to influence perceptions of race and history. Understanding this interplay between religion, ideology, and commerce is crucial to comprehending not only the mechanics of the Arab-Muslim slave trade, but also its enduring impact on African societies and diasporas, illustrating how faith and power can be manipulated to justify human suffering while leaving long-lasting imprints on social consciousness. Ultimately, the use of scripture and the curse of Ham to rationalize the enslavement of black Africans underscores the ways in which ideology can be wielded to legitimize systems of exploitation, revealing a sobering intersection of belief, commerce, and human cruelty. By examining these historical narratives and their consequences, we gain insight into the depth of the trade's social, demographic, and cultural impact, highlighting the resilience of those who endured unimaginable suffering while challenging us to confront the moral complexities of history with honesty, reflection, and a commitment to remembrance. The centuries-long Arab-Muslim slave trade left scars on the African continent that went far beyond the immediate suffering of those captured and transported across deserts and seas, producing demographic, social, and economic consequences that reverberated for generations and reshaped the very fabric of societies across sub-Saharan Africa. With millions of men, women, and children forcibly removed from their communities. Entire regions experienced profound population imbalances, as the extraction of young and able-bodied individuals left villages weakened in their capacity to sustain agricultural production, defend their territories, and maintain social cohesion, while the removal of women and young girls disrupted family structures. Reproductive potential and the continuity of cultural traditions. These demographic shifts were not only numerical but also qualitative, as the loss of specific age groups and genders imposed long-term consequences on the capacity of communities to regenerate themselves, altering the trajectories of development, settlement, and local economies in ways that would be felt for centuries. Social structures, too, were deeply affected by the trade. Families were torn apart as parents, children, and spouses were separated, often permanently, creating patterns of grief, displacement, and social fragmentation that reverberated through generations. Communities were deprived of their natural leaders and laborers, resulting in a decline in traditional governance systems and the weakening of cultural institutions that relied on continuity and the passing of knowledge across generations. In addition, the constant threat of raids and the knowledge that anyone could be captured bred a climate of fear and uncertainty, shaping social behavior, migration patterns, and the development of defensive strategies that disrupted trade, education, and community life. This pervasive insecurity not only eroded trust within and between communities, but also reinforced social hierarchies imposed by those controlling the trade, entrenching systems of exploitation and subjugation that altered the balance of power across regions. Economically, the slave trade had a devastating impact on African societies, as the removal of laborers drained regions of the human capital necessary for sustaining agriculture, trade, and artisanal production. Fields once tilled by local farmers lay fallow, irrigation systems weakened from lack of maintenance, and local industries were unable to thrive without a stable workforce, while the demand for slaves in distant markets incentivized violence and competition between local rulers, diverting attention from long-term economic development and sustainable governance. Trade networks, previously oriented toward the exchange of goods and the flourishing of regional economies, became subordinated to the logic of human extraction, as communities were incentivized to capture and sell their neighbors or rivals to satisfy the demands of Arab and Berber merchants. The resulting pattern of exploitation created a cycle in which economic growth was subordinated to predation, undermining the stability and prosperity of societies while funneling wealth and human capital toward distant markets rather than sustaining local communities. The demographic consequences also intersected with cultural and political dimensions, as the removal of influential members of society disrupted the transmission of traditions, knowledge, and leadership. The extraction of men and women from positions of responsibility and expertise created a vacuum in political and religious leadership, weakening states and kingdoms, reducing their ability to resist further incursions, and altering the balance of power both within and between regions. Moreover, the dispersal of African captives across foreign lands created diasporas that were often denied the opportunity to preserve or transmit their cultural practices, languages, and social norms, while the loss of entire generations deprived local societies of the mentors, teachers, and community builders necessary for cultural continuity. These compounded effects on governance, education, and social cohesion meant that the slave trade was not simply an economic or demographic phenomenon but a force that reshaped the identity, resilience, and agency of African societies in profound and enduring ways. Gendered impacts of the trade further magnified these consequences, as the disproportionate targeting of women for concubinage, domestic service, or reproductive purposes had lasting effects on family and community structures. The removal of large numbers of women disrupted marital patterns, reduced birth rates, and placed enormous strain on men and remaining families, while the creation of eunuchs from young boys undermined future population growth and social continuity. These gendered dynamics also reinforced hierarchies of power and control, as those who profited from the trade manipulated social norms and labor practices to maximize wealth and maintain dominance over captive populations, leaving lasting legacies of inequality, trauma, and social disruption. The Arab-Muslim slave trade also reshaped the geographic and political contours of Africa, as regions became depopulated while trade routes, oases, and cities were transformed into centers of extraction and commerce. Strategic points like the Nile Valley, the Maghreb, and Red Sea ports grew in importance as hubs of the trade, drawing wealth and influence to regions that facilitated enslavement while further impoverishing the hinterlands. The constant movement of captives through deserts, across rivers, and along caravan routes created corridors of human suffering but also disrupted patterns of settlement, land use, and political allegiance, leaving indelible marks on the historical geography of the continent. Despite the immense suffering and disruption caused by the trade, African communities exhibited resilience and adaptation, developing strategies to survive, resist, and endure under extreme pressure. Oral histories, cultural practices, and resistance movements preserved memory and identity, even as the structural consequences of the trade continued to shape social, economic, and demographic realities. Communities rebuilt, negotiated survival under shifting political conditions, and maintained cultural continuity even in the face of sustained depopulation and disruption, demonstrating the tenacity of human agency amidst the forces of systemic exploitation. Ultimately, the demographic, social, and economic damage inflicted by the Arab-Muslim slave trade was profound, affecting countless lives and leaving long-lasting legacies that shaped the trajectory of African history. From population imbalances to weakened institutions, disrupted family structures, and altered economic systems, the trade reshaped the continent in ways that extended far beyond the immediate horrors of enslavement, reminding us of the enduring human costs of exploitation and the resilience required to confront and recover from such historical trauma. The story of this trade is a testament not only to suffering but also to survival, endurance, and the capacity of communities to reclaim identity, culture, and continuity in the face of centuries of disruption and loss. Even though legal frameworks formally abolished the Arab-Muslim slave trade over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, the shadow of enslavement lingers ominously into the present day, manifesting in clandestine operations that continue to exploit vulnerable populations across parts of North and West Africa, most notably in Libya and Mauritania, where political instability, economic desperation, and weak governance have allowed old patterns of exploitation to persist under new guises. In Libya, for example, the collapse of centralized authority following the civil conflict and the ousting of long-standing regimes created a vacuum in which militias, human traffickers, and criminal networks could operate with impunity, preying on migrants and locals alike. Thousands of individuals fleeing conflict, poverty, or persecution find themselves trapped in detention centers, informal holding facilities, or along desert routes, where they are sold, rented out, or coerced into forced labor, enduring conditions that echo the horrors of centuries-old caravan journeys across the Sahara, yet now amplified by modern forms of violence, neglect, and systemic corruption. The mechanics of this contemporary trade resemble the historical structures that once facilitated the trans-Saharan routes, with captives transported across harsh terrains, including deserts and borderlands, under the supervision of armed groups or traffickers who leverage knowledge of geography, local networks, and mobility to maintain control over their victims. Migrants are often lured with false promises of work, education, or safe passage to Europe, only to find themselves subjected to extortion. Physical abuse, sexual exploitation, and labor coercion, sometimes for months or even years, while families, powerless to intervene, are forced to pay ransoms to secure the release of their loved ones. The commodification of humans in this context reflects a continuity of logic from the historical trade. Individuals are valued not for their personhood but for the labor, skills, or reproductive potential they can provide, and economic incentives perpetuate cycles of capture, sale, and exploitation. In Mauritania, the persistence of slavery has been more deeply intertwined with entrenched social hierarchies, with certain ethnic and caste structures allowing practices akin to servitude to continue despite official prohibitions. Families are passed down in conditions of inherited servitude, where the status of bondage is not merely a consequence of capture, but is embedded into social norms, creating multi-generational chains of exploitation that are difficult to break. Even when legal abolition is proclaimed, enforcement is sporadic, judicial mechanisms are weak, and social stigma against challenging traditional practices often silences victims, allowing slavery to survive quietly in plain sight. These modern forms of bondage underscore the ways in which historical legacies of enslavement persist, adapting to contemporary circumstances while retaining the central characteristic of human exploitation. Reports by international organizations. Investigative journalists and human rights advocates provide disturbing documentation of the ongoing realities of illegal slavery in these regions. Video footage, testimonies, and field investigations reveal patterns of abuse that include physical violence, deprivation, sexual exploitation, and psychological coercion, often facilitated by intermediaries who profit from the commodification of vulnerable populations. In Libya, for instance, migrants from sub-Saharan Africa, including women and children, are subjected to auction-like sales where individuals are bartered for labor or sexual servitude, echoing historical markets in Morocco, Tripoli, and Cairo, yet taking place under modern technological and economic contexts that render them both invisible and globally relevant. Victims are often trapped in cycles of debt, ransom, and forced work, with their survival contingent upon the payment of sums they rarely can afford, exposing the interplay between desperation, coercion, and organized exploitation that sustains these clandestine networks. The continuity between past and present is further highlighted by the methods employed to justify, perpetuate, and conceal these forms of exploitation. Whereas historical Arab traders used religious interpretations, selective readings of scripture, and social norms to rationalize the enslavement of black Africans, contemporary traffickers rely on economic rationalizations, legal loopholes, and political instability to operate with impunity. While the moral and ideological frameworks have evolved, the underlying logic remains consistent. Vulnerable populations, particularly those marginalized by geography, ethnicity, economic status, can be subjugated, commodified, and exploited with minimal resistance, provided the systems around them, whether legal, social, or political, enable such practices. Communities affected by modern slavery continue to demonstrate resilience and agency, echoing the endurance of African societies during the centuries of historical enslavement. Non-governmental organizations, international bodies, and grassroots movements work to rescue, rehabilitate, and reintegrate victims while advocating for stronger enforcement. Social awareness and structural reform. Awareness campaigns. Investigative reporting and international sanctions aim to disrupt trafficking networks and highlight the ongoing plight of those subjected to forced labor and sexual exploitation, demonstrating that global attention can exert pressure even in the face of deeply entrenched practices. These efforts reflect a continuity of struggle, linking the experiences of contemporary victims with the long historical arc of the Arab-Muslim slave trade, emphasizing both the persistence of injustice and the capacity for human intervention. Advocacy and resilience. Understanding the persistence of slavery today in places like Libya and Mauritania is crucial for contextualizing the historical Arab-Muslim slave trade and its enduring legacies. The demographic, social, and economic disruptions initiated centuries ago have left vulnerabilities that traffickers exploit, while modern geopolitical, economic, and social conditions perpetuate patterns of exploitation reminiscent of the past. By connecting historical narratives with contemporary realities, we gain insight into the mechanisms by which human exploitation adapts across time and space, underscoring the importance of sustained vigilance, advocacy, and action to protect the most vulnerable populations. Ultimately, the continuation of illegal slavery in the modern era is a stark reminder that abolition on paper does not necessarily translate to freedom in practice, and that the lessons of history must inform both local and global efforts to confront exploitation. The story of these modern slaves, like that of millions across the centuries, challenges us to confront injustice, recognize resilience, and commit to building systems that prioritize human dignity, security, and rights, ensuring that the horrors of enslavement become a chapter not only of the past, but also of conscious, collective effort toward a freer, more just world. As we come to the close of this exploration into the Arab-Muslim slave trade, it becomes painfully clear that despite the immense suffering, exploitation, and long-lasting damage inflicted upon African communities over more than a millennium, this chapter of history remains under-discussed and often overlooked in global discourse. The reasons for this are complex and deeply intertwined with religious solidarity, cultural sensitivities, and historical bias, all of which have contributed to a collective silence that has allowed the magnitude of the tragedy to fade from public consciousness. While the transatlantic slave trade is widely taught, analyzed, and remembered, the trans-Saharan and Eastern trades, which were equally devastating, have not received the attention they deserve, leaving millions of lives and the consequences of centuries-long exploitation largely unacknowledged. This lack of awareness not only diminishes historical understanding, but also undermines the ongoing fight against modern forms of human trafficking and forced labor, which in some ways are echoes of the same systemic injustices that began centuries ago. Education is therefore essential not just for historical knowledge, but as a tool for empowerment and prevention. By learning about the Arab-Muslim slave trade in its full scope, from its origins in ancient raids to its modern manifestations in regions like Libya and Mauritania, we gain critical insight into the mechanisms of exploitation, the vulnerabilities that traffickers exploit, and the ways in which communities can be supported to resist and survive. Raising awareness about these issues fosters empathy, understanding, and a sense of responsibility across cultures, helping to ensure that modern abuses are recognized, challenged, and eradicated. The stories of those who endured unimaginable suffering remind us that the human capacity for cruelty can be vast, but so too is the human capacity for resilience, solidarity, and justice. By bearing witness to history, we honor the lives of those who were lost or harmed and equip ourselves to prevent similar atrocities from occurring in our own time. It is also crucial to confront the cultural and religious narratives that have historically been used to justify the trade. Misinterpretations of scripture, selective historical accounts, and the shielding of uncomfortable truths have perpetuated a version of history that obscures the suffering of Black Africans and the complicity of those involved. A candid, evidence-based discussion of the Arab slave trade challenges these narratives, encouraging societies to acknowledge past wrongs, reconcile with historical truths, and commit to ethical principles that protect human dignity. In doing, we not only honor the memories of the victims, but also create a foundation for cross-cultural dialogue that can foster accountability, empathy, and meaningful change. Moreover, examining the long-term consequences of the trade demographic shifts, social fragmentation, economic disruption, and cultural dislocation offers lessons that remain relevant today. Communities impacted by centuries of enslavement developed strategies for resilience and survival. Yet the legacy of trauma continues to influence social and economic realities in Africa and among African diasporas worldwide. By studying these patterns, policymakers, educators, and human rights advocates can design interventions that address structural vulnerabilities, provide support for survivors of modern slavery, and ensure that the lessons of history inform the prevention of future exploitation. Raising awareness is not merely an academic exercise, it is a moral imperative. Each person we educate, each story we share, and each conversation we foster contributes to a collective effort to dismantle the structures that allow slavery, whether historical or modern, to persist. Supporting organizations that combat human trafficking, advocating for stronger legal protections, and amplifying the voices of survivors are concrete ways in which we can act on the lessons of history. In the same way that remembering the horrors of the Arab slave trade serves to honor the lives lost, taking proactive measures today ensures that we do not become complicit through inaction. As viewers, learners, and global citizens, we carry the responsibility to not let history repeat itself. Recognizing the realities of the Arab-Muslim slave trade, understanding its consequences, and confronting modern abuses with courage and knowledge empowers us to create a world where exploitation is no longer tolerated. By shining a light on these stories, we foster a culture of accountability, compassion, and human dignity. We remind ourselves that history is not only a record of suffering, but also a call to action, a call to build systems, policies, and societies that protect the most vulnerable and uphold justice for all. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and to engage with a topic that is often hidden from mainstream narratives. Your attention, curiosity, and willingness to learn are essential parts of changing the conversation and preventing abuses in the present and future. If you found this content meaningful, please give the video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel to stay informed about untold histories and important stories that deserve to be remembered. Every action, from subscribing to sharing knowledge, helps amplify awareness and ensures that the voices of those who suffered are not forgotten. I hope you carry with you not only the knowledge of what happened, but also a sense of responsibility and compassion that can make a difference in the world today. Let us remember the strength, courage, and resilience of those who endured unimaginable hardships, and let their stories inspire us to act against injustice in all its forms. Thank you again for watching, for learning, and for standing in solidarity with history's overlooked victims. May you have a peaceful night. Sleep well, and wake with renewed energy to make a difference in your own way.